The trial was almost over. A man about to be sentenced, a gavel raised, ready to strike. Then, out of nowhere, a 12-year-old girl stood up, interrupting the judge with 4 words that made the entire courtroom freeze. The prosecutor's eyes darkened, the air turned heavy. Because in that moment, the girl had touched a truth that powerful men had fought to bury. But she didn't know one thing. From the second she spoke, she had just become their next target. Would you have the courage to stand up against power, knowing it could cost you everything? Drop a comment below and get ready for a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Now let's dive into the story of Nia Carter, the girl who changed a trial with just 4 words. The courtroom was silent, not just quiet, but the kind of stillness that presses down on your chest, making every breath feel heavier than the last. At the front of the room, Judge Whitmore adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable as he lifted the wooden gavel. In just seconds he would bring it down, sealing the fate of Mr. Benson, a man who had spent his life shaping young minds, now branded as a criminal. Across the room, Daniel Cole, the prosecutor, leaned back in his chair, watching with the confidence of a man who had already won. His tailored suit was pristine, his expression calm, but there was a glint of satisfaction in his eyes, the kind that comes from knowing that no one would dare question him. No one, except her. In the back row, Nia Carter, just 12 years old, sat stiffly between her mother and a group of strangers. Her small hands gripped the edge of the wooden bench, knuckles turning white. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. "Stay out of this, Nia. You can't change anything." But another voice cut through the doubt. The warm, steady voice of Mr. Benson, the man who had taught her how to question everything. "If something happens to me, don't believe what they tell you. Find the truth." And now, as the gavel hovered above the judge's desk, ready to strike, ready to send an innocent man to prison, she couldn't stay silent. Nia stood up so fast that the wooden bench beneath her scraped against the floor. Then, with a breath that shook, but a voice that didn't, she spoke. "He didn't do it." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. For a moment, nothing moved. The walls of the courtroom, the jury, the rows of spectators, it was as if time itself had paused. Judge Whitmore's hand froze midair, the gavel trembling slightly in his grip. His usually stern expression wavered, something flickering in his eyes before he masked it just as quickly. The murmurs started then, a slow ripple spreading through the crowd. Who said that? A kid? Is she serious? What does she know? Daniel Cole's relaxed posture stiffened, his fingers once lazily tapping against the table, now curled into a fist. He turned slowly, scanning the room until his gaze landed on her. And in that moment, Nia saw something she wasn't supposed to see. Fear. Just for a second. A flicker of something dark behind his calm exterior. But then it was gone, replaced with a smirk, smooth and practiced. "Nia," her mother whispered harshly, grabbing her wrist. "Sit down." But it was too late. The silence had been broken. The questions had begun. And Nia Carter had just made herself part of the story. The streetlights flickered against the cracked pavement, their dim glow barely cutting through the night. Shadows stretched long and thin down the narrow alleys, where old brick buildings stood shoulder to shoulder, like silent witnesses to everything that happened in this neighborhood, both seen and unseen. Somewhere nearby, a siren wailed, sharp and distant. A group of young men leaned against a corner store, their eyes watchful as a police cruiser rolled slowly past. Nia Carter walked a little faster, gripping the straps of her backpack. She knew these streets well. Every crack in the sidewalk, every broken fence where kids cut through to save time. But knowing them didn't mean she felt safe. Not here. Her mother's warning played in her head. Justice doesn't work the same for people like us, Nia. You step out of line, and the world will remind you where you belong. Her mother wasn't wrong. She had seen it before, how the system worked for some and crushed others beneath its weight. But what if someone wasn't just being crushed? What if they were being framed? She was on her way to meet Mr. Benson, the one teacher who had ever made her feel like her questions weren't just a nuisance, but a weapon. Mr. Benson was exactly where she expected him to be, sitting on the same worn-out bench near the community library, tossing breadcrumbs to the pigeons. "Nia," he greeted, his voice warm, but his eyes looked tired. You okay, Mr. Benson? She asked, sliding onto the bench beside him. He exhaled through his nose, the way grown-ups do when they want to say something but aren't sure if they should. Do you ever wonder why people see only what they want to see? Nia frowned. Like what? He tossed another piece of bread. Like how sometimes the truth is hidden in plain sight, but no one bothers looking. Something in his tone made her uneasy. Are you in trouble? She asked, her voice quieter now. Mr. Benson turned to her fully, his expression unreadable. Then, after a pause, he reached into his coat pocket and pressed a small folded piece of paper into her hand. If something happens to me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, don't believe what they tell you. Find the truth. Nia's fingers curled around the note. Her mouth opened to ask what he meant, to ask why he sounded like this was goodbye. But before she could, he stood. Time for me to go, he said with a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Stay curious, Nia. She watched him walk away, disappearing down the street. The night swallowed him whole. The next morning, the world cracked open. Nia sat frozen at the kitchen table, staring at the television screen as the news anchor spoke. Former history teacher accused of embezzling over $2 million from student scholarship funds. Her stomach twisted. The screen flickered to a mugshot. Mr. Benson, looking nothing like the man who had sat beside her just the night before. The calm wisdom in his eyes was gone, replaced by something hollow. Her mother stood behind her, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. I told you, Nia, you think you know someone, and then you don't. Nia shook her head. That's not true. Her mother sighed, moving to the counter. It doesn't matter what's true. What matters is what they can prove. But he didn't do it, Nia whispered, gripping the note still crumpled in her palm. Her mother turned, sharp now. You don't know that? Yes, I do. Nia shot back, standing up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. He gave me this. She held out the note, heart pounding. Her mother barely glanced at it. That doesn't mean anything. Nia's chest tightened. You don't get it. Her mother's face hardened. No, Nia, you don't get it. You're 12. You don't understand how dangerous it is to ask the wrong questions. The words cut deep, but Nia squared her shoulders. I don't care. Her mother inhaled sharply. You have no idea who you're up against. Then I guess I better find out. The tension in the room was suffocating. Her mother exhaled, pinching the bridge of her nose. Just stay out of it, Nia. This isn't your fight. But as she looked at the television screen again, at the face of a man who had once told her that truth mattered, she knew one thing for sure. If no one else would fight for him, she would. And that's when she made her choice. What exactly had Mr. Benson uncovered? And how far was Nia willing to go to prove his innocence? Nia sat in the back row of the courtroom, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had slipped in unnoticed, blending into the sea of unfamiliar faces. Adults rarely paid attention to kids unless they were causing trouble. Today, she was counting on that. At the front of the room, Daniel Cole stood confidently, his voice smooth, controlled, rehearsed. The evidence is clear, Your Honor. The defendant, Mr. Benson, had direct access to the scholarship funds. The digital records show large, unauthorized transfers, millions of dollars funneled into offshore accounts. The jury watched, nodding slightly. The judge remained expressionless. But something felt off. Nia frowned, listening carefully. She wasn't an expert in legal matters, but she had heard enough crime stories to know that cases weren't usually built on just electronic records. Where were the witnesses? The physical proof? There should have been bank statements, paper trails, or surveillance footage. Instead, every single piece of evidence existed only in digital form. That wasn't just strange, it was deliberate. Nia's fingers tightened on the folded paper in her pocket. The note from Mr. Benson. He had known this was coming. But if someone had framed him, who had the power to erase all physical evidence? Her stomach twisted as she glanced toward the prosecution table. Daniel Cole met her gaze. For a split second, his mask slipped, just enough for her to see it. Recognition. And beneath that, a flicker of amusement, like he knew exactly who she was, like he wasn't worried about a kid. But he should have been. After the trial recessed for the day, Nia slipped outside, her mind racing. She needed more than just suspicion. She needed proof. Hey, kid. She jumped. A boy, maybe 16 or 17, leaned casually against a lamppost, hands stuffed into his hoodie. His dark eyes flicked over her, assessing. "You got guts speaking up like that in court," he said. "But guts won't save you." Nia stiffened. "Who are you?" "Jay." He tilted his head toward the courthouse. "I used to work for them." Her breath caught. "The prosecutors?" Jay let out a dry laugh. "Not exactly." She waited, her pulse quickening. "My brother Adam used to work for Daniel Cole," Jay continued, his voice lower now. "He found something he wasn't supposed to. Then, poof, he disappeared. And just like that, every record of him working there, gone." Nia swallowed. "You think Cole?" Jay nodded. "I know Cole is dirty. He's not just some prosecutor. He's running something bigger." Nia hesitated, then pulled out the crumpled note from Mr. Benson. "He told me to find the truth," she murmured. "But I don't even know where to start." Jay glanced at the paper. His eyes narrowed. "You just did." Jay's old connections led them to an abandoned storage facility on the outskirts of town. Mr. Benson used to work with community outreach programs, Jay explained as they sneaked in through a rusted side door. "There's a chance he hid something here, something they didn't wipe clean." Nia's sneakers crunched against the dusty floor. The place smelled like old paper and mildew. They rifled through stacks of forgotten records, searching for anything that didn't belong. And then Nia found it. A leather-bound book, wedged between two broken filing cabinets. "The ledger," Jay whispered. Inside, pages upon pages of names, dates, and transactions detailed something much bigger than just missing scholarship funds. This wasn't just about Mr. Benson. It was a record of fraudulent transactions spanning years, with Daniel Cole's name appearing over and over again. But just as Nia turned the page, the door slammed shut. A shadow moved across the room. They weren't alone. Jay reacted first, grabbing Nia's arm and yanking her into the darkness. Footsteps echoed through the storage unit. Heavy, purposeful. Whoever was there, they weren't searching. They already knew what they were looking for. "Check the files." A low voice commanded, "Make sure nothing's missing." Nia's breath hitched. They knew about the ledger. Jay's grip on her tightened. "We have to move. Now." They crept toward the back, their bodies pressed against cold metal shelves. The voices grew louder. Two men, both dressed in dark suits, scanning the room. One of them stepped closer, his shadow stretching long across the floor. Nia's fingers clenched around the ledger. If they took this, all the proof would be gone. She wouldn't let that happen. Her heart pounded as she locked eyes with Jay. And then, she ran. Jay swore under his breath but followed, their footsteps pounding against concrete as the men shouted behind them. The exit was just ahead, a flickering green exit sign barely visible through the dust. They burst through the door just as a gunshot rang out behind them. The bullet shattered glass, sending shards raining onto the pavement. Nia didn't stop running. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but the only thing that mattered was the book in her hands. They had proof. And now, they had a target on their backs. Somewhere behind them, a voice spoke into a phone. "They have it." A pause. "Find them. At any cost." Nia now has the truth. But will she survive long enough to use it? The first time Nia noticed the black car, she brushed it off. The second time, her stomach twisted. Now, as she hurried down the cracked sidewalk, heart hammering, the car was still there, crawling at a snail's pace, its tinted windows like dark, soulless eyes following her every move. She tightened her grip on her backpack, feeling the weight of the ledger hidden inside. She needed to move. Turning sharply, she ducked into an alleyway, hoping to shake the tail. The air smelled of damp concrete and stale garbage, but she didn't care. She pressed her back against the brick wall, forcing her breath to steady. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe A shadow shifted at the alley's entrance. Nia barely had time to register the figure before a gloved hand clamped over her mouth. Her scream was muffled as she was yanked backward, feet scraping against the pavement. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and faceless behind a black ski mask. She thrashed, kicking wildly, but his grip was iron. He didn't speak, didn't hesitate. He was taking her. Panic surged like ice through her veins. She bit down hard on his hand. The man hissed, grip loosening just enough. Crack! A fist slammed into his jaw, sending him stumbling backward. Nia gasped, free now, her lungs sucking in precious air. Jay stood between them, his fists clenched, eyes burning with fury. "Run," he ordered. Nia didn't hesitate. She bolted, feet pounding against the pavement, Jay right behind her. Behind them, the masked man let out a frustrated curse and took off after them. They sprinted through twisting back streets, dodging trash cans and leaping over puddles. The city's usual sounds, honking horns, murmuring voices, felt a million miles away. All that mattered was running. They cut through a broken fence, barely squeezing through before Jay kicked it shut behind them. "We have to lose him," she gasped. Jay grabbed her wrist, yanking her behind a rusted dumpster, pressing a finger to his lips. Seconds later, the man skidded to a stop at the alley's mouth. Nia's pulse pounded so loudly she was sure he could hear it. The man stood there, scanning the alley. Then, finally, he cursed and stormed off. Jay exhaled. That was too close. Nia's legs wobbled, the adrenaline fading, leaving only fear. "They're not trying to scare us anymore," she whispered. Jay's jaw tightened. "No," he agreed. "They're not." Jay's hideout was a crumbling storage unit, filled with old laptops, tangled wires, and stacks of newspaper clippings. He grabbed the ledger from Nia's bag, flipping through its pages. Then, he pulled out his phone and started typing furiously. "What are you doing?" Nia asked, still catching her breath. Jay didn't look up. "Benson's numbers. If Cole laundered money, there's got to be a digital trail." Minutes passed. Then, Jay's fingers stilled. Nia leaned in. "What?" He turned the screen toward her. "Bank transactions. The money hadn't disappeared. It had been transferred, not stolen, straight into a corporate shell linked to Daniel Cole." Nia's stomach dropped. "He moved the money himself," Jay murmured, then framed Benson to cover his tracks. Her fingers curled into fists. This wasn't just corruption. This was an entire criminal operation. And now, they had proof. Nia looked at Jay, her chest tight. "We need to get this to the court," she said. Jay nodded. "Yeah, but first..." His head snapped up as his phone buzzed. He frowned, then his face went pale. "What is it?" Nia asked. Jay turned the screen toward her. It was a text message. Just 2 words. "We see you." Somewhere a phone rang. A man answered, listening quietly. "They found it?" A pause. He exhaled slowly, then stopped them. A beat. "Whatever it takes, the truth is out. But will Nia make it to court before the truth gets buried forever?" The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, every pair of eyes locked onto the front of the room where Judge Whitmore sat, his gavel resting heavily on his desk. Nia's heart pounded as she gripped her backpack, her fingers damp with sweat. Inside, the ledger sat like a ticking time bomb. Across the room, Daniel Cole looked as composed as ever, his suit crisp, his expression unreadable. But his eyes flicked toward Nia for just a fraction of a second. He knew. He knew she had something. And she knew he wasn't going down without a fight. "Your Honor," Cole said smoothly, rising to his feet. "The evidence against Mr. Benson is overwhelming. The prosecution has presented a clear digital trail of his crimes. There is no reasonable doubt here." Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Nia took a deep breath and stood. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "There is reasonable doubt, and I can prove it." A hush fell over the room. Judge Whitmore's sharp eyes settled on her. "Miss Carter, this is highly irregular. You are not a lawyer." "I know," Nia admitted, "but I have proof that Mr. Benson was framed." She unzipped her backpack, reached inside, and pulled out the ledger. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. "This book contains records of fraudulent transactions," Nia continued, her hands trembling but her voice strong, "and none of them lead to Mr. Benson. They all lead to one person." Her eyes locked onto Cole. "You." The courtroom erupted. Judge Whitmore banged his gavel. "Order!" But Cole didn't flinch. In fact, he smirked. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "this is a desperate attempt to derail these proceedings. A child presenting evidence? Let's be serious." "You want serious?" Nia shot back. "Let's talk about how none of your evidence exists outside of a digital footprint. No physical proof, no paper trail." Judge Whitmore turned to the prosecutor. "Mr. Cole, would you care to respond to these claims?" Cole didn't miss a beat. "Gladly." He stood, adjusting his tie as if this was just another day in court. "The defense can produce as many distractions as they'd like," he said, "but the facts remain, and to further solidify my case," he gestured toward the doors. "Your Honor, I have a witness." The doors opened, and a man in a gray suit walked in. Nia's stomach dropped. The man sat at the witness stand, his expression carefully neutral. "State your name," Cole instructed. "Matthew Graves," the man said. Cole nodded. "Mr. Graves, can you confirm that Mr. Benson personally transferred the stolen funds into offshore accounts?" Graves turned toward the jury, his face unreadable. "Yes," he said firmly, "I can confirm that." Nia's blood ran cold. It was a lie. Jay, sitting beside her, muttered under his breath, "They planted a witness." Nia clenched her fists. Cole had planned for this, and now, unless something changed, he was going to win. "Your Honor," Cole said smoothly, turning back to the judge, "I believe this testimony." A sharp buzz crackled through the courtroom speakers. Then a voice. "Ditch the paper trail. Wipe everything clean. Pin it all on the old man." The words ripped through the courtroom like a bullet. Cole's face went pale. "What the hell is that?" he snapped. Judge Whitmore's expression darkened. "Mr. Cole, I suggest you explain yourself." But before Cole could open his mouth, a woman stood at the back of the courtroom. Dark suit, cold eyes, badge flashing. Special Investigator Rachel Carter, Internal Affairs. The entire room gasped. "I've been following this case for weeks," Carter continued, stepping forward. "And what you just heard? That was Daniel Cole, talking about framing an innocent man." Cole lunged for the recording device, but an officer blocked his path. "You can't do this," he roared. "This is a setup." "Sit down, Mr. Cole," Judge Whitmore ordered, his voice like steel. The tension was suffocating. Then, the judge turned to the bailiff. "Place Mr. Cole under arrest." Cole exploded. "You don't know what you're doing," he shouted as two officers grabbed him. "You think this ends here? You think you won?" His eyes locked onto Nia, and then, as he was dragged away, he smirked. "Clever girl," he murmured, "but the game isn't over." The courtroom was a storm of voices. Reporters scrambling for quotes, lawyers muttering in disbelief, Mr. Benson, eyes glassy with relief, and Nia, just standing there, heart still racing. Jay nudged her. "We did it." She should have felt victorious, should have felt safe, but all she could hear was Cole's voice. The game isn't over. Somewhere out there, someone else was pulling the strings, and Nia Carter wasn't done. Not yet. The late afternoon sun spilled golden light through the courthouse windows. The courtroom was nearly empty now. Reporters had left to break the news, the jury had been dismissed, and Cole was long gone, dragged away in handcuffs. But Mr. Benson was still here. He stood near the defense table, rubbing his wrists as if shaking off invisible shackles. His face was weary, but his eyes were free. Nia watched him, standing quietly by the door. "You did it, kid," Jay murmured beside her. Nia swallowed. She should have felt relief. She should have felt triumphant. But something inside her whispered that this wasn't over. She stepped forward and Mr. Benson turned to her. "You okay, Mr. B?" she asked softly. The old man exhaled, then smiled, the kind of smile that held years of weight behind it. "I am now," he said, "thanks to you." Nia shrugged. "You would have done the same for me." His smile widened. "That's what I tried to teach you, Nia. Sometimes the right thing is the hardest thing to do." She nodded, knowing he was right. Because justice, real justice, wasn't handed out easily. Sometimes you had to fight for it. As she stepped outside the courthouse, her phone buzzed. She pulled it out, expecting Jay or her mom, but the number was blocked. A single text stared back at her. "You think Cole was the only one?" A chill crawled up her spine. Nia's fingers tightened around the phone. She scanned the street, her heart pounding. Cars moved as usual, people walked by, faces blurred in the crowd. But suddenly, it felt like someone was watching. Jay leaned over her shoulder, reading the message. His expression darkened. "Looks like we pissed off the wrong people," he muttered. Nia's throat was dry. Maybe, or maybe, they pissed off the right ones. "You okay, kid?" Nia turned to see Agent Rachel Carter, the no-nonsense investigator who had taken Cole down. Carter's sharp eyes flicked to the phone in Nia's hand. She didn't ask. She didn't have to. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, a business card. She held it out. "Call me," Carter said, "if you ever find another truth someone doesn't want uncovered." Nia hesitated. Then slowly she took the card. Carter smirked. "Something tells me this isn't the last time we'll be seeing each other." And with that, she turned and walked away. As the city lights flickered on, Nia stood on the courthouse steps, the business card warm in her palm. She thought about everything that had happened, about Mr. Benson, about Cole, about the real players still out there. She wasn't just some kid who had stumbled into the truth. She had uncovered something bigger, and if there was more to be found, she was going to find it. Nia Carter wasn't done yet. Not even close. Justice was served today, but in a world full of secrets, who will be the next to fall? Did this story keep you on the edge of your seat? If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who loves a good mystery. Your support means the world to us and helps us keep creating powerful, thought-provoking stories. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next deep, gripping tale. Every like, share, and comment fuels our passion to bring you more stories that matter. What would you have done in Nia's shoes? Let us know in the comments below. See you in the next story.